Good morning. I'm Dave Mastin, Vice President of Government Affairs at AWB. Thank you for joining us today as we look at the preview of the 2022 legislative session. We're facing some challenging times as we begin session. We're looking at spiking inflation, supply chain disruptions, labor shortage, and we're about ready to enter in the third year of a pandemic with a new variant that is taking hold of our country and our state. And this is how session begins. And this year, the session is going to starts on Monday. It's a 60-day session. It adjourns March 10th. It started out a couple weeks ago. They thought it was going to be a hybrid system. And now we're hearing that it's actually going to be pretty much like last year, mostly remote, might be a little bit of adjustments as we go along, but definitely starting the session in a remote phase. Want to go on and take a pause here just for a second and talk about the Q&A. So we're going to go through our presentation and we're going to save questions and answers to the end. And so please look at your Q&A icon in the Zoom control panel. Any questions you have, put those in, and then we'll get back to those at the end of the presentation. To begin with, I want to introduce our government affairs team. To begin with, we have Amy Anderson, who is the Government Affairs Director for Healthcare, Early Learning, Education, Workforce Training, and also leads our federal issues. We also have Bob Battles, who's the General Counsel and Government Affairs Director for Legal Affairs and Employment Law, which includes wage and hour, workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, workplace safety. We also have Mike Ennis, who is our Director for Transportation, Land Use, Telecommunication, and Rural Vitality. Peter Godlewski, Government Affairs Director for Energy, Environment, and Water Policy. And then Tommy Gantz, who's the Government Affairs Director for Tax and Fiscal Policy and also leads our manufacturing effort. To start, we're going to begin with an issue that's received quite a bit of attention over the last couple of years, and particularly last session, and then there's additional issues coming up, and that's the long-term care program known as Washington Cares. And here to start is our Amy Anderson, our Director on Healthcare, and she's going to kind of lead us through this. So Amy, can you give us an update on the long-term care issue that we're facing?
Sure, thanks Dave, and definitely the updates come on an hourly basis sometimes right now with this one. So the last session we had the bill that passed actually put in place a limit on the opt-out availability for people once they purchase a long-term care product. Had to be purchased by November 1st of 2021. You now have the opportunity, as long as you had that product in place by November 1st of last year, to apply to opt out of having that tax taken out of your paycheck. You have until the end of this year to opt out of that. By statute, the taxes, the premiums were set to be taken out of your paycheck beginning January 1st, 2022. Employers by law are mandated to do this. We've had some confusion. The governor has released statements, as has Employment Security Department and legislative leadership, that they are going to put a pause on implementation. That is the intent. There is still in law, the statute's still there, that you must collect those taxes. But the intent by the legislature is to propose some delay in implementation. They do have some bills, and I'll go through those here pretty quickly, that will address that issue. So where we're at right now, Dave, is yes, the law is still in place, the program's in place as is, and so we move forward into next week.
And then with the statute, it talks about the collection. It's actually the agency rule that says, well, if you don't collect, what's the consequence, right? So we've got a combination of statute and rule, neither of which have been changed. And so this is where we're facing a lot of unknown simply because policymakers are standing up and saying, hey, we're going to change it, but they haven't changed it, right? And the governor has not directed the agency to change the rule either. So we're kind of where we were before they even started talking.
Yep, absolutely. But we do have several bills that have been pre-filed and introduced. Representative Arbano put quite a few bills out that do provide exemptions for economic hardship, recent college graduates, transfer of benefits after death, as well as provides benefit for eligible beneficiaries who reside outside of Washington. And we have that theme, the issue of people who live in, for example, Idaho, Oregon, but work in Washington state, having to pay that but not eligible for the benefit. So Representative Schmick, same thing. He has a few other pieces in there that he's addressing with his piece of legislation, that being one of them. And then Senators Mullet and King did introduce a bill that would provide an exemption for retired military. There are two key bills, though, that we're going to see. Representative Sullivan, his bill delays implementation of the Long-Term Care Act until July 1st, 2023. So premiums will not be collected until July 1st of 2023 should this bill pass. It expands eligibility to near-term retirees, so those who are within the next few years of retiring will be eligible at a lower percent of a benefit. It also establishes in law then that the premiums collected prior to that July 1st, 2023 date should be refunded to employees. Now, Representative Paul's bill does establish the exemption for veterans, certain military spouses, certain temporary workers, and Washington State employees who reside outside of the state. So we did hear from legislative leadership that codifying the delay in implementation is a priority and that they are committed to addressing this up front. The House is taking the lead. The Senate will not be introducing any companion bills. Okay. But again, they are committed to this. Both Senate Representative Sullivan's bill, 1732, and Representative Paul's bill, 1733, are scheduled for hearings in the House Appropriations Committee on Tuesday, January 11th, and then an executive session on Thursday, January 13th. So we do see this moving quickly. They do want to address it, hoping it'll get there.
Okay, so summary, we have like 5 or 6 different bills doing different things. The ones that we're seeing like there looks like there's going to be early action is the one that delays the entire law for 18 months. And then Representative Paul also has a bill that does some adjustments as well. We expect to see those in the hearing. Hoping something comes to the floor the following week. Have we had any indication yet from the Senate exactly when they're going to pick it up, or is that a wait and see?
That's wait and see, with the understanding that the Senate is also committed to moving this through quickly, because they do know that our businesses, our employers need clarity, as do our employees in the state. Okay,
and do we have a bill? Is there a bill been introduced that just says let's repeal the whole thing right now and not have this?
Nobody has gone there yet.
Okay, so. All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Amy's going to join us a little bit later to talk about a few other items that we see coming up in the legislative session. Right now, we're going to turn to budget and taxes. Tommy Gantz is going to join us with that. I believe she's joining us by Zoom, and so we're going to bring her on. Good morning, Tommy.
Good morning.
Want to talk about budget and taxes. Every year, this seems to be a high-level discussion and lots of stuff going on. I was hoping maybe you could provide for our listeners maybe just a backdrop of kind of how we got to where we are, what's happened in the recent past.
Sure. I think we put some information out there on this, but over the last 3 years, there has been the introduction of 22 new taxes that have passed to the tune of about $40 billion over the next 10 years. For reference, our state budget total in 2009 was around $23 billion. Last session, it was $60 billion. So the certainty we have right now is that there have been taxes every year.
So over 3 years, 22 tax bills, it adds up to over $40 billion in additional revenue over the next 10 years. So it seems like a pretty consistent streak of raising taxes. I understand our state budget, we heard a couple years ago that, the revenue's in trouble, there's lots of problems, but obviously most of the reports coming in every quarter is that things are doing better. Can you give our listeners an update on where the budget stands, revenue, operations, how that works right now?
Yeah, absolutely. We have right now a budget surplus of $8.6 billion. With the budget outlook and revenue forecast, there's no justification whatsoever for operating tax increases. We do know that we're hearing talk that they'll still continue with some tax bills, perhaps a wealth tax. We've heard of that one making a comeback, but that didn't get really good reception from anyone in the tax structure work group. There was no positive feedback on that. And we've also heard Senator Carlisle make mention of a B&O surcharge on banks related to carbon reduction efforts.
Okay, so $8.6 billion in reserve, that's over the four-year outlook. Despite the amount of money coming in, there's still apparently some discussion about how to raise taxes. I'm also hearing discussions and wondering about the opportunity. Is there more focus, or is there more effort to protect taxpayers taxpayers, employers, to limit tax increase and maybe even reduce taxes and create some kind of protection for in the future?
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the taxes that have been introduced are more punitive in nature than really raising revenue. We're continuing to have conversations, especially around the work of the tax structure work group, that we need some constitutional limitations around the amount of taxes that can be raised. Last year, they passed capital gains. Basically, it was at first we needed the revenue, and then it was we need a progressive tax system. But really, we think that now is the time for tax relief. They did nothing on that side to reduce other taxes to sort of balance that. So, now we think there's time for tax relief because we have this budget surplus. It would be great to see a property tax relief through uniform rate reduction or sales tax relief, or lowering the B&O on manufacturing is something we've been fighting for a number of years. And that would help the legislature achieve their goal of doubling the number of manufacturers. But the biggest thing is creating an environment of certainty for our businesses and ensuring that there are some constitutional limitations around that work.
Yeah, and you mentioned the B&O tax, and clearly a huge impact on our small employers as well as our large ones, but just definitely a huge impact. Also understand that the sales tax, just our sales tax on what our businesses pay on sales tax on input, is actually the number one tax for them. If we were to change the crystal ball and say, hey, we're going to get a tax reduction, I guess some concerns that I hear from employers is, yeah, that's just 1 year, and then they'll come back next year and raise it again. Mm-hmm. Is any comments or any ideas about how to protect it ongoing and not just have it be at the next legislature comes in and says, well, we didn't do that, we want to change?
Yeah, again, constitutional limitations would be the best way to achieve that. I think the one thing that our current tax structure has proven is that it's very stable in times of economic certainty. It has provided the revenue that we need, but it's providing more revenue than we need. So limiting that would be super helpful for our business community, and creating that environment of certainty. I think we're losing some businesses to other states who do have a different tax structure, but really it's not about the structure, it's about the certainty. Businesses need to be able to plan around things, and not knowing what the taxes are going to look like, and even in any given year, makes it really difficult to plan around that.
So maybe a good message to the legislators after 22 tax increases in the last 3 years, 40 billion, as you mentioned, enough is enough, right? It's time to look at this a little differently.
Absolutely.
Tommy, thank you for joining us. We'll certainly have some questions for you later on, so we'll bring you back at the end of the program. But thank you for joining us right now. We're going to shift our focus now to energy and environment. And so our director, Peter Godlewski, is joining me here, and we're going to start off with some of the big issues we're seeing, Peter. Natural gas seems to be a little under attack, quite honestly, in what we're dealing with in this legislature.
Yes, unfortunately, natural gas is going to be the next big fight in climate for this state. The governor has announced 4 bills that he has. His governor's request legislation, which seek to raise costs on the natural gas system. AWB has concerns about all of those. We will be working with our members to make sure that the businesses that use natural gas can count on that affordable, reliable fuel in the future.
And in our energy use in the state, obviously, most of it's hydro. The dams provide most of our energy use, but the other two are nuclear power and energy. Those are the two. Those three are kind of the big amigo, so to speak, in the whole energy world.
That's right. Natural gas provides both energy for electricity generation as well as direct consumer consumption, as we call it, the burner tip. Certainly, when I think cold weather, we've all appreciated the ability of having natural gas to turn on our furnaces or stoves or even fireplaces if you're so lucky to have them. Next up, legislature is also looking at cap and trade. Last year, there was a huge cap and trade bill, and the bill directed the Department of Ecology to do some agency request legislation. They have put that forward this year. Maybe you can share, obviously, most of our members are familiar with cap and trade issues, but maybe you can give us a brief summary of what that is, and then what do we see happening out of Ecology's, out of their proposal? Sure. Well, the cap and trade bill that passed last year, the hardest part of this sort of the cap and trade issue has been the EITEs, energy intensive trade exposed entities. And these are companies that produce materials that are globally traded, but they're also high energy inputs. And so they're a lot of Washington-based businesses such as pulp and paper, concrete, aluminum, metal smelting, all rely on heavy energy inputs. Finding ways that they can continue to operate effectively in this state while also working with the cap and trade legislation has been the hardest part of this bill. Last year, they created a compliance pathway for the EITEs to 2030, but the program goes actually on to 2050. So Ecology was directed this year to create a proposal to give EITEs a compliance pathway to 2030, past 2030, excuse me, allowing them both to operate and from the state's perspective, help reduce emissions and meet the state's 2030, 2040, and 2050 greenhouse gas reduction targets.
Okay. So a lot going on there. We'll see how that bill works its way through the process.
We'll be working with our EIT members to make sure that they have that protection so they can continue to operate and both in the state and help grow jobs in manufacturing.
Well, let's shift now from that to plastic packaging. We a lot of work in there. There was just a work group that came up with some reports, I understand, in December, and we were engaged in that work group. Tell us what's in store for the legislative session.
So there is a large extended producer responsibility bill that has been worked on over the course of the summer. AWB members and AWB have provided comments on this legislation. This is a material neutral piece of legislation, which means that all materials are being covered. That's plastic, glass, aluminum, cardboard, paper products. And
this is all in one bill.
All in one bill.
Okay.
And basically, it's the management of the packaging in the state. AWB is opposed to this particular piece of legislation. We don't believe that material neutral is, in this case, the way to go. We think that, and specifically, we should be focused on each of the different material types and provide a little bit more focused specificity on how those different benefits and costs of those programs or those materials can be better used in the state. So we are currently opposed to this massive piece of legislation.
Well, it sounds like a incredible shotgun approach, right? Rather than being more focused and let's get down on the real, these are real detail issues. This is very difficult policy where the details really matter. And it's harder to do that in an omnibus bill with all these different things. People get confused. Which section are you talking about? And it really makes sense to break this up into a little bit more smaller bites, so to speak, and try to work through it that way. So that's a challenge with what we're facing in the legislature.
Yes, it is.
On all of these things, particularly the natural gas, I'm thinking about House Bill 1170, which the legislature passed last year. It's a bill that says we're going to double the number of manufacturing jobs in the state of Washington over the next 10 years. We're going to double the number of manufacturing companies owned by women. We're going to double the number of manufacturing companies owned by people of color. This is the legislature passed unanimously last year. That isn't just that's a pipe dream unless you actually do stuff that's going to make that happen. And then when I see that we're actually putting natural gas, sounds like what the proposals are going to raise the cost of natural gas. How does that impact our ability to double manufacturing?
Well, it makes it really difficult. Natural gas is a really important feedstock for certain advanced material processes and for advanced manufacturing type jobs and work that can be done with this energy source. So it's an important fuel to have and protect, and having it affordable and reliable is really important for our manufacturers. It's difficult to see that you would be able to increase and double manufacturing in the state by adding costs on top of what already exists here.
And it's one of our huge advantages, right?
Absolutely. One of Washington's biggest competitive advantages is our low cost, affordable, and reliable energy. Hopefully that is something that we will be able to continue to have and count on in the future.
Okay. Well, Peter, thank you for the update. Peter will be available later on. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A in the Zoom control panel, and we'll get back to Peter with those questions.
Thank you,
Thanks
Dave.
for joining us. Next, we go to employment law. We have our director and chief legal counsel, Bob Battles, is here with us to talk about some of the main areas in employment law. Bob, good to see you again. Key tam. Sounds like key tam once again.
Key tam is an interesting animal, Dave. As we've said, we talked a lot about this last year.
Mm-hmm.
We fought long and hard. Key tam is about private rights of action in cases that already have enforcement provisions. It's something that's been pushed heavily by the labor community. We have fought long and hard about it this last year. We will continue to that fight this year. We were able to stop it last year. And the bill that still stays in effect until the end of this session. But it can result in frivolous law actions. It can result in a professional plaintiffs class. All of these things are definitely a concern, and we will continue to fight and be vigilant on that this year.
I understand that there's a law, very similar law in California. It's caused a lot of disruption. And then when you look at our safety and our employment and our employers on location, the safety and the Department of our departments looking at investigating like complaints, that there's not a backlog, that this is not a big issue. This is not something that's being created because the agency's not doing their job or that there's a lot of unsafe conditions. That's not what's causing this, and yet it's still, this thing's still here.
That is absolutely correct. There is no backlog. We've been assured that by the agencies that are responsible for these particular laws that will be affected. And actually, kind of in response to a question you asked Peter here right before about manufacturing, what happens when manufacturing, if we want to expand manufacturing, which I think is a very important goal of that bill and very important, for all of us in the state of Washington, we can't overregulate. And this is one of those things that could ultimately result in litigation and everything. And what happens with private right of action is really it's regulation by by litigation as opposed to by regulation. Thank you.
Well, we'll jump from key temp to unemployment insurance. Now we know a couple years ago when the governor made the announcement in our state, most of the economy shut down. Lots of folks that were otherwise would have been working are now on the unemployment and insurance, getting unemployment, which is a great program. But it also, employers, as I understand, Bob, employers pay for that system. And now all of a sudden their ratings are going up because of this government mandate to slow work down. Again, it was related to COVID, so we understand that. But again, now it seems like the employers are having to pick up that tab. Last year, tell us what happened last year with the legislature.
So last year, this was probably one of the number one issues that started off the legislative session. The fact is that unemployment insurance really probably kept our economy going. That and the federal program that allowed not independent contractors to continue to get benefits as well. I mean, that made people have income even with the shutdown. So two bills took place last year. One that created a cap on certain fees and a cap on how much increase could happen to help sort of smooth out portions of the program. A second bill, and that's really 5478, actually put money that was going to be infused into the system under a formula for those that had been impacted by it. It does not eliminate all of the costs that employers have had been hit by this. It's 100% employer funded, and every employer in the state, regardless of whether you stayed open or didn't, was hit with an increase. 5478 was a good start. It was a $500 million portion. We're just finding out now in this last month, since starting late December, on how much that is going to impact people's individual fees. When I mean that employers, and the reason why is because that's based on they automatically got it if they had certain increases, they were in certain classes, and it dropped their fees. We know, though, at that time, even when this was done, that $500 million was probably a small portion of at least a $2 billion problem. So we think as we see how much this did, we may need to be going back. And I think we're going to need to be going back and asking for more. But good things are happening with the unemployment. Let me say that the fund is having less money going out because people are coming back to work. There's more money coming back in, but that's because employers are paying more now. So there's a balancing out, but that doesn't solve the whole problem, and everybody is still impacted, and this is an issue that we need to be concerned about.
And I recall from last year, this was a bit confusing because on the one hand, the legislature's putting $500 million, right? $500 million into this program, and also struggling with the concept that our employers were still having a tax increase. This isn't the tax increase that the legislature has to vote on. This is an automatic tax increase that was going on. Even as they were providing relief, the employers in our state were feeling that pinch of an annuity tax. I understand that there's been some other taxes that have gone up that are ones that are not the legislative directed, but are just part of the automatic system.
That is correct.
And can you share just a little bit on those?
So we have systems throughout this whole process that have automatic formulas that create it. And so a good example, workers' compensation is based on the average. Certain portions of that are funded through an average weekly wage, and that sort of triggers what you pay on it. It's a sort of pay as you go. Interesting, the average weekly wage in Washington State went up during the pandemic, not because everybody's getting paid more, but because some of the lower wage jobs went away, higher wages. So now we have this artificial increase. it's triggered a result that actually under workers' comp on the supplemental budget has really resulted in almost another million, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars that are going to be hit by employers because of this formula that really is artificial.
We could probably go all day on unemployment insurance.
Yes.
We're going to jump to the next issue. I guess in summary, we're working hard, AWB, you're working hard to make sure that legislators know that there's hidden taxes. It's not just the taxes that they vote on, but there are taxes going up that are impacting our employers, our employees, and our economy. And so we're going to continue to be a voice on that. Again, we could talk about this forever. Let's move on, though, and let's talk about data privacy. It's an issue that's been before the legislature, I don't know how many years, several years, but again, it's before us again. Can you give us an update on where we're going this year with?
Yeah, data privacy continues to be a major issue. We at AWB are also working on the national level with the U.S. Chamber and several folks to try to find can we find a common privacy policy that's nationwide so we don't create a patchwork. As that goes forward, though, we are seeking to try to find solutions in Washington state. Proposals have been put together. Senator Carlisle's bill still is in existence. It's one that we have supported. We know that there is discussions with the governor's office, with the attorney general's office, and the House to propose new bills. Unfortunately, the bills that are being talked about in those groups still have that private right of action that we just talked about in KETAM. And again, it's regulation through litigation. It doesn't really help that small business owner. And these bills are going to hit the small business owner. It's going to hit the mom and pop shop that still is doing their payrolls on the kitchen table on Sunday night and literally signing the front of the check. But it also is going to hit your large folks because that's the problem. This is not an easy fix. We're continuing to work with those groups. We've got many coalitions working together. There are some bills. Actually, interestingly enough, one of the bills that was adopted in Virginia was actually Senator Carlisle's 2019 bill. It is a model now becoming for the nation. It is a bill we would support. So hopefully we'll hopefully find a solution. I have got concerns, though, with what some of the House is proposing.
All right. Just definitely looking at when every state does their own thing, it creates a really difficult for employers and for employees how that works. And so going at having one set of rules makes at least there's some predictability with that.
Yeah, and we're committed to the privacy of individuals and the use of data. So this is not about trying to avoid that. This is really just about trying to make a system that works both for employers and employees and his customers.
Last up, we have to talk about apprenticeship extension. Apparently, there's some movement afoot on doing some new things in apprenticeship. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, this has become a sort of a new issue. We've always, AWB has always supported apprenticeships in the concept of apprenticeships and believe that as long as apprenticeships are fairly applied to everyone having access to them, that we think these are good things. These are going to help our workforce. That Amy Anderson works with us on this. All of these things are positive. Senator Kaiser has made this a priority for herself, and it's going to be a priority that she has said that this is a long-term project.
And Senator Kaiser is
the chair of the Senate Labor and Commerce Committee. So this is where this bill would land and where this will be heard. So in fact, it has actually got a hearing scheduled for I believe it's Thursday of this next week, and so it's going to be up front. We're going to be talking about this bill. There are issues, though, in the apprenticeship process, and a lot of reform needs to be happening. We've seen this from our members. We've got members on all sort of sides of this, but the reality is that you've got an apprenticeship council that has some time issues of getting accepting of apprenticeships and trying to develop those. It is mainly apprenticeships right now have mainly been in your construction and your trade area, and some aerospace. This bill, which we support conceptually the concept, but not the bill itself at this point, about the expansion to hospitality apprenticeships and recognizing there's federal apprenticeship programs in hospitality. It also expands the healthcare. It expands the apprenticeships for the tech area. All these are great concepts. Unfortunately, what this bill would do is actually put all of those programs under the construction and trades group, to regulate those other industries. That doesn't make sense to us in the big scheme of things. We're working with the sponsor. We're looking forward to trying to find solutions on it. We definitely want the recognition of the federal apprenticeship programs. Hospitality has been one of those big ones that they have a federal program that is accepted. Why can't we accept some of those programs in Washington State? They're already on a national level. These are kind of important things. So I expect that we're going to be talking about this one for the next couple of years. And look forward to working with the senator on this issue.
And it's just a classic example of what we deal with in the legislature in Olympia, that most issues, most bills aren't one or the other. There's a lot of gray, and there's things to work on. There's things you like, things you don't like. And our job here is to make sure that the employer's voice is heard and that we're pushing to make those changes. And of course, Bob has been an outstanding leader on this for employment law for us for quite some time. Bob, thank you, and we'll probably be bringing you back a little bit later if we get some questions on these areas.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Next up, we're going to talk transportation, all things transportation. Leading this discussion for us and our efforts is, of course, Mike Ennis, who is the GA Director on Transportation, Land Use, Rural Vitality. And so we're going to start with transportation. Mike, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks. Good morning, Dave. Good morning, everybody. Glad to be here.
Let's start with what we already know is the law. Federal infrastructure package passed earlier this year, so we know we're getting funding coming down in a variety of categories. Obviously, there's some mix with what the state's doing, what they were talking about, all that with the feds. Can you share like what's going on with the Fed package? How does that influence what we're doing at the state?
Yeah, great question, Dave. Thank you. It's true. The federal government has had fits and starts over the last 10 years or so on federal infrastructure packages. AWB has been there every step of the way, trying to encourage additional funding for infrastructure at the federal level. So good news, the federal government did finally pass a federal infrastructure package. Early reports indicate that we could receive up to about $8.6 billion over the next several years to fund infrastructure. So again, good news. AWB partnered with the cities, ports, and counties the last couple of years to do a needs assessment across the state on our infrastructure needs and found that Washington has about $200 billion of infrastructure needs. So $8.6 billion toward that $200 billion need is a good first step. Obviously, we need a lot more. So working at the state level to help find a room or encourage the conversation on a state package to help fund infrastructure so we could further close that gap as well.
And I just recently heard the report that we did with the counties, the cities, the ports. In Washington, D.C., our members of Congress and in the House and in the Senate both referenced that this report is what they are using as they go through and look at the federal projects and how this funding should work. They actually used the report that we co-authored, put together, which is fantastic because now they're listening to what the important issues are that we're bringing to them. And so we'll continue to work on that. I'm going to bring it down to the state level. Let's begin. The big news is we have a new chairman. So maybe you could share with our listeners what that's about.
Yeah, that's right. So the previous chair of the Senate Transportation Committee was Senator Hobbs. He, of course, has been appointed to the Secretary of State's office, and we congratulate him on that appointment. The new chair for the Senate Transportation Committee is Senator Leas. The House Democrats did choose him to lead their effort on transportation. He was the majority floor leader for a number of years, and then also served as ranking on transportation early on in his first years in the legislature. So I've worked with him on a number of items on transportation-related issues, have a great relationship with Senator Leas. Not only me, but the rest of the business community does as well. So excited to see him there. I think we'll have good progress on transportation policy going forward. He has a transportation mind, so I'm very excited about that. And he, I think, at least early on, has been very positive toward his view on infrastructure funding. I think he shares the same view that we do, that there is a return on investment with infrastructure, and that there is a need for it as well.
All right, so Marco Leas from Mukilteo is not new to transportation, so we're not hitting the ground at the beginning. He's got background in that.
Right.
After last session, you led an effort by AWB going around the state, regional meetings, talking about the packages or proposals that were out there, talking to our members, finding out, hey, where are you on transportation in the future? What packages, what proposals? Can you share with our listeners we did quite a bit of work. So maybe you can share kind of what we did and then what'd you find out? What did we hear?
Yeah, thank you. So this summer, we visited 12 different communities across the state to hear from employers on where they stood on transportation. A lot of developments have occurred in the last year, and we always like to have a finger on the pulse of employers in Washington to better understand where they're at with all the changes that have taken place. So we wanted to hear from them and get an update or a temperature check, so to speak, on where they're at on transportation funding going forward. And to summarize what we heard, we put out a whole document on key principles on what those findings are. If you're interested in that full document, please reach out to me. But a great phrase that summarizes the entire process of what we heard is, it's not a question of if, but when. Employers certainly recognize there's still a need for infrastructure funding in Washington. Like I said, a $200 billion need. The federal package was a good step towards that. There's still a need at the state level for funding as well. They just question, I think, the timing of everything with the COVID response, $4 a gallon gas, and the climate policies that passed last session. It's a little, there's a lot of uncertainty on the horizon. So employers are a little bit worried looking forward on infrastructure funding and want the legislature to be very careful on how they move forward.
And so to be fair, I mean, and I got to join some of those meetings, and so that was very informative. We had a lot of folks, I think, it uniform that, hey, we need to move forward on transportation, no question about that. What we heard is a mix from, I think, mostly the gas tax. Should there be a gas tax increase? We had some members going, not sure we're ready for that right now. We had other members saying, look, the problems are what they are, and we need to move forward on this. And so we had a little bit of split, right, which is part of being an association. You have some of that, but the commitment to move forward on transportation, I think, is strong. And we're coming into the next session, and we're going to see some proposals. Can you share with us what you've heard so far? What our listeners should expect from on the transportation front?
Yeah, great question. So last session, we had a number of transportation at the state level, transportation tax increase proposals to fund a package. Senator Hobbs had one with Ford Washington. I think that one had the most traction. There's sort of a question mark there about how the legislature treats that one going forward since he's no longer there. I'm not sure if they'll start over or if they'll use sort of what he's created as a platform to step off from. Representative Fye, chair of the House Transportation Committee, of course, has his proposal out there as well. Senator Elias, incoming chair of the Senate, is now currently talking about proposing a package from him. So I think that's good news as well. And then Senator King and Senator Saldana had their proposals as well. I don't know if we'll see new ones from them or if they'll just base their positions on what they've already proposed. But a lot going on. I fully expect we'll see a lot of conversation regarding a transportation package at the state level this session. I think it's unlikely that the state funds or passes a package in the traditional sense. I think it's unlikely we'll see a gas tax this session, but I do fully believe that there'll be a lot of conversations around funding transportation using existing resources.
And one thing that strikes me, Mike, is we're talking about transportation and having folks kind of, all supporting moving forward, concerned about revenue, how we do all that. The thing that that catches my mind is, typically when you pass a transportation package, you have a package that legislators are all talking about a package. And this is the package everyone's talking about. We're moving forward on this one, and that's where you get the votes and you see advocates pushing for it. We don't have that. We didn't have that last year. There's 4 or 5 different proposals. Representative Barkas has a package as well to take a car sales tax. I'm going to ask you to talk about that in just a second, but I guess my point is it's really hard to say you support something until there's something there to support, and the legislature hasn't coalesced yet.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. A lot of different proposals out there on how to fund transportation. I think that's good news. Having a robust conversation about how to fund infrastructure leads to nothing but better policy. So that doesn't scare me at all. I don't think the legislature is quite ready to pass a robust package this session or even last session, obviously. But at some point in the next year, 2 years, couple of years, we will see a package and it will fund infrastructure, I think, in the way that employers will benefit from.
Representative Barkas, he had a proposal.
Yeah,
you want
great,
to share.
great.
He has a package.
I'm glad you reminded me about Representative Barkas's proposal. He's proposing something a little bit different. He doesn't like to call it a traditional package or even a package for that matter. He likes to.
My bad.
Yeah.
Excuse me, Representative Marcus.
He's more on the reform side. He wants to sort of prioritize transportation funding at a much higher level. We totally agree with that. Something we heard from our members on our regional tour was that we wanted to prioritize infrastructure funding more. And his proposal certainly does that. It mostly revolves around shifting funds from the operating budget to transportation, and then backwards shifting some transportation obligations to the general fund. That's something that I think the business stakeholders have been asking for a number of years. There has not been any traction on that issue. And it doesn't matter whether it's Republicans or Democrats in charge of the budget. There's always been hesitancy about using general fund dollars for transportation. So this is a big shift in thinking of how to fund transportation going forward. I think it's good news. I think this is a good conversation to have. And while I think that there won't be a traditional package this session, we could see some of that fund shift concept take place in the transportation budget this year, where the operating side is now starting to fund some infrastructure on the transportation side.
Okay, so that's good news looking at that. So we're going to potentially see something, maybe not a big package, but we're going to potentially see something. We're going to move to land use here pretty quick. Before we do, on this transportation, I think one of the critical points for our listeners is to know that AWB continues to be at the lead, at the forefront, pushing for transportation and economic. It's part of economic development. We're going to continue to do that as the legislature looks for at the different proposals as things start to come together. Not likely to jail this year. Possible, but not likely, but out into the future, continuing. Mike, thank you for being that strong voice on transportation for us.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to plug real quick, if I may, our Friday calls. I schedule we have a transportation committee call every Friday during session, and we go over the bills that are scheduled for hearings the following week and talk about broader transportation issues. If you're interested in those calls, please contact me and I'll get you on the list.
Let's move to land use. Last year, there were a few issues, but not a lot that were passed. We've got a lot on the plate this year. Can you share some of the land use bills that we're looking at?
Yeah, a great question. Before COVID, the legislature was poised to take on GMA reform. We've been under GMA for 25 years now, and we've had, of course, the Ruckelshaus study that identified a lot of need for improvement in some areas, and the legislature was ready to take that on, like I said, before COVID. COVID has really sort of changed priorities in the legislature, and we haven't really seen a lot of movement on that effort or on that front. However, there has been a lot of legislation to make changes. And of course, our definition of GMA reform is very different than other groups' definition of GMA reform. So there's been a lot of debate about what's been proposed. I fully expect to see some GMA reform bills come up this session. We saw them last year. The majority parties in both chambers will want to try to push those this session. The business community is aware of these bills. We're following them. We're having input on them, and my committee at my land use committee within the association is tackling these issues. Again, if you're interested in participating in that committee, reach out to me and I can get you on the list.
And I want to share with our listeners, Mike, you and I have talked about this before, but when we're looking at different issues, again, last year the legislature passed a bill doubling the number of manufacturing jobs in 10 years, double the number of manufacturing companies owned by women in 10 years, double the number of manufacturing jobs owned by people of color in the next 10 years. Legislature unanimously passed that. Everything they're doing, we're asking that question. Is this proposal going to help us move in that direction, or is it going to hinder? We heard a little earlier from Peter that there's some bills out there that go the opposite direction. On these land use, without getting into the details of each bill, in general, are they helping us move to increase manufacturing, or are they moving the other direction?
That's a great question, and the answer is debatable. The legislation that was proposed last session, the business community largely opposed them for a variety of reasons, and one of them, like you said, it would hurt the ability of the state to double manufacturing in the next number of years. That's a problem. Bob mentioned regulations. Regulations are a big issue for the business community, especially in land use. When permits take 1, 2, 3, 4 years to get submitted or to get approved before you could start building, that creates a lot of uncertainty for employers and businesses wanting to expand potentially in other areas because of those higher costs and uncertainty of whether the permit even gets approved.
Okay. Mike, thank you. Appreciate you coming here. We may have some questions for you at the end, and so you may end up coming back in front of us.
Great.
We are going to shift back to, we're going to bring our Amy Anderson back up. We're going to talk about a couple of the big areas that are issues for the legislative session in her area. She's the Director for Healthcare, Early Learning, Education, Workforce, Training and Development. Also does our federal issues. We talked a little bit earlier about the long-term care on the healthcare side. Amy, thank you for coming back. And next is child care. We have some things coming up for the session. Can you share what those are?
Sure. So in 2021, the legislature passed the Fair Start for Kids Act, which, in addition to some other addressing some issues that need to be taken care of with the state childcare system, it increased subsidy to providers. It also expanded eligibility to Washington state families to participate in the state-funded program. So this year, we're going to see some technical fixes for the Fair Start for Kids Act. And one of the big things that they're really trying to work on is how do we adequately compensate our childcare workforce, whether it's not only wages, but also benefits, healthcare, retirement, et cetera. There are several cost of care studies currently underway. We are doing it with our Child Care Collaborative Task Force through the State Department of Commerce. Seattle's doing one, DCYF is doing one. So that may have to wait until next session. They may work on that a little bit over the next couple of months, but until we actually have an adequate understanding of what the actual cost to provide care regionally as well, it's really tough to estimate what type of money and funding is needed to adequately provide for our child care providers.
Okay.
We do have, Senator Hasagawa has introduced a bill 5630. This one is the proposal is to include early learning in the definition of basic education.
Oh.
And then to define early learning as birth through age 8. I think that's something that's been talked about. That is of concern for AWB from the business perspective of including our early learning, our childcare system in the K through 12 system. So I look forward to those discussions. I think this is something that will be discussed this session. It's not going to be decided, but we will have some pretty robust conversations about that. So,
and maybe you can share with listeners, we've actually, AWB has been at the forefront of bringing that childcare is an employment issue. It is an employer's issue. This is something that it is part of what employers are dealing with, and it is something that's important for us as a business community to address. That's a different statement than saying the solution that this person came up with is the right solution. And maybe you can share a little bit, you've worked so much in this area to bring this to the forefront. Maybe you can just share a little bit with our listeners, kind of the background on how we've been leading this effort from the business side.
Sure, thank you for that, Dave. I would just start by saying, if there is a silver lining to this pandemic, and I know we are all tired of it, it's that the issue of affordable, accessible childcare is now an economic and a workforce development issue. One of the biggest issues, and you see this in survey over survey, of people having a difficult time getting back into the workplace, is the lack of childcare. If they can even find it, it may not be affordable. It's a tough item for families. They cannot pursue education and training opportunities because of a lack of childcare as well. So from the business perspective, we need our employees back into the work site. We need them to be comfortable and know that their children are being well taken care of, that their social emotional needs are being met. So I would say that might be a positive of the pandemic, is that this issue has now come to the forefront, and it helps us, if we're businesses at the table, to really help understand the needs of the business, needs of the employees, and then so to make good policy going forward. And how can business help support their employees in that?
And one of the critical things, and you and I have talked about this, the critical points is while everyone's now starting to see bringing child care, early learning to the front, right, of something to deal with, solutions we see coming out of OSPI, Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, the solutions we see coming out of the other agency engaged with this, is kind of a government-only solution, and that's why it's so critical that AWB remain committed and vigilant and engaged in this, because it's not just a government-only solution. It's a private, public, both, and we've got to make sure that our providers that are doing this, that they still have the ability to do it, and that legislation doesn't keep them out of providing that important child care support.
Yeah, that's a good point. We definitely need to find public-private solutions. Childcare is not a Monday through Friday, 7-hour a day need, right? We have to make sure that we have diversity in delivery, diversity in schedule. Regions are different. We have to have economic diversity that meets, or childcare that meets the economic diversity, and family choice too. We want families to feel comfortable with where they're taking their children. Study after study shows you that in those early years, that's when you have your brain development, your social, emotional development, cognitive. And in order for our children to be successful in their K through 12, post-secondary, their careers, they need a solid early learning. And that's going to require public and private participation and collaboration. So we'll keep pushing for that.
Yeah, very critical role for AWB to stay involved. And Amy's been an absolute leader, not just for AWB, but quite frankly in the country, in the state and the country in this arena. So we're lucky to have Amy working on this. Let's shift now from early learning to our traditional K-12 and higher ed and workforce development. What are you seeing in the legislature this year in that area?
So, our K through 12 and our post-secondary system have seen declining enrollment and increased costs due to the pandemic. Again, it's kind of showing these fracture points in our education system, our healthcare system. So what we're seeing, the legislature this session will address equality and access to higher education through increasing funding for like the College Bound Scholarship program, as well as dual credit opportunities such as college and the high school and Running Start programs. So really trying to address some of those equity issues and making sure that people our kids have access to those opportunities. One interesting bill that has been introduced, Representative Dolan introduced a bill to support charter schools in allowing having local effort assistant funds flow to charter schools, particularly for enrichment activities in the region. That's not allowed right now. And AWB has a long history of supporting charter schools. We do believe that it really is a good tool in eliminating barriers in education. So happy to see that one. Funding, the school districts certainly are concerned, given the decline in enrollment, what that means for funding for the schools. So I think we'll see some work, whether that has to be legislatively or just within the agencies itself. We'll definitely see some work with that.
And the challenge there is our school systems are funded per employee and when per student. So when there's fewer students, they receive less money. This is totally anecdotal, but 3 of my sisters are in the education world, and they have talked about they feel like the students that are coming back are like 2 years behind, and it's just been a super challenge. And so this is a year where if the enrollment's not there, do we still need the staff, the counseling, and those folks there to make sure that we're helping the students start to catch up? And so this is an issue they're going to be dealing with.
Yeah, and there's a couple of bills too that are addressing the increased needs for the social emotional needs and mental health counseling. Kids are being bounced back and forth. We're in school today, we're not in school today because we have COVID surges. It's also they are behind because of this. And then being at home, learning from home, and then all of a sudden you're put into the classroom setting, that's a huge transition. So not only behind in learning, but being able to be back into that system, into that environment it's critical that we address those needs in order to mitigate the impacts, the learning impacts. So we'll see that in this session.
You mentioned a few higher ed issues, Running Start, college and the high school. Are there any other issues on workforce training or higher education proposals that we're seeing that have been introduced yet, or things that you expect to see as the session goes on? Yeah,
I think our workforce efforts really are going to be fueled by a lot of the funding that Mike was talking about, the federal infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure, the BIF, that was passed in November, that President Biden signed into law in November. We have a ton of money coming into Washington State. I think it's about 1.8 billion just for roads, just for transportation projects. Doesn't include the broadband funding and some other pieces as well, bridge replacement, et cetera. And so, those are big projects that are going to require a skilled and trained workforce that we don't necessarily have. We are in an unprecedented time of a workforce shortage. We have our businesses who are having to limit services and goods because they don't have the staff to meet those needs. So, we start throwing in money for projects and we don't have the staffing to help deliver on those is going to be even more difficult. Now, the Bring Back Better America, the BBB, whatever we're doing now, has not passed. But that will see investments in housing and education, particularly in pre-K and childcare efforts. So hoping that, if that does pass, we may have some additional funding that will help support some of these systems. One thing we are seeing, getting back to childcare too, is a lot of these scholarship programs, access to student funding for post-secondary efforts, are starting to include funding for wraparound services like transportation, like childcare, things like that. So really opening up access is going to be critical right now because we have such a high demand for workforce.
So we'll stay tuned as we go through that legislative process with all these budget and policies. Yep. All right, thank you, Amy, for that. Thank you. We are now going to, if you have questions, please put them into the Zoom control panel. And we're going to be going through those questions in just a moment. Amy, I think I'm going to have you stay, because if we're going to have any questions for you, you'll be starting out. So before that, we're going to look at the upcoming events. So before we do questions, answers, we have a couple upcoming events. I want to make sure I get those covered. We have the AWB Legislative Day and Hill Climb. That's January 18th and 19th. In the past, it's been a one-day event, but now that we're doing a little bit more remote hybrid type stuff, where we've extended it to a two-day event. So that is January 18th and 19th. And then we will have our regular lobby lunches on Thursdays. This first one will be January the 13th, and then and we'll have notices out about this, and we'll have that every Thursday. So now I'm going to switch back to question and answers. I'm looking down at the bottom. Is that the question that we have so far? Okay. We're going to pause here just for a second. We have one question that's a revenue question. We're going to see if there's any questions for Amy on long-term care or early learning or K-12 workforce. And we do have one. We have one for Amy. So I'll go ahead and ask you, Amy, do we need more shop classes in high schools?
Great question.
Yeah.
And absolutely, we, the traditional shop classes that we think of that we've experienced or we see from historical efforts, we do need to have more work-based learning that takes place in the high schools, whether it's learning tech skills or carpentry skills or manufacturing skills. Very critical. And we have a lot of good projects and programs taking place around the state that are good collaborations between the education system and business. A couple that come to mind, SEH America in Vancouver, silicone manufacturers. They have an established internship program that they work with the local school district on, bringing in high school students. Both of Vista Utilities and Wagstaff Manufacturing in Spokane do the same thing during the summer. And these are paid internships for our high school students. And something that we, through the AWB Institute, we have our intern portal where these work-based learning opportunities are listed from schools, and students can go on there, teachers can go on and really take a good look at where are those opportunities. High school, junior high, that's really good time for kids to take a look at, hey, what do I enjoy doing? What do I need to do? And learning a good practical application of the theoretical curriculum that they're learning. How is it that their math applies? It's one thing to learn it in a book, but if you have to apply it to building something, it's just brilliant. That's where it clicks. So absolutely we do. And we've been working quite a bit with Core Plus, Career Connect Washington to expand some of those opportunities for kids.
And the Core Plus program with aerospace, Boeing being such a leader on that for aerospace. And now there's two other ones. Our Association of General Contractors worked on the Core Plus construction. We continue to expand. There's one for maritime as well. Lots of efforts out there, a lot of work to do, definitely a lot of work to do. Yep. Okay, we're gonna go to our second question. This is for Amy. It's a logistics question. Will there be a weekly education call during session this year? Yes, so.
Yeah, Dave will run it this session.
No.
Yes, we will. So that email will be going out today to the education committee. If you don't receive that or you aren't on our education committee, shoot me an email. It's just amya@awb.org and let us know that you want to be on the committee, and we'll get that out. I believe we have them scheduled for Monday at 9 a.m. I think that's what it is.
And for the other listeners, we have different committees connected to legislative committees and policies. And every week we have at least one meeting, and often more than one meeting for each committee. And they talk about the bills that are going to be heard or voted on on the committee that week or bills to the floor, mostly at the committee level, to talk about where is AWB on this issue? Do we support it? Do we oppose it? Or could we support it if there were amendments? Are we going to testify? So there's a lot of discussions that go on with the directors in charge, and Amy does this for healthcare. She does it now for education, early learning, education, workforce development, and then our other directors cover their areas. And so if that's an area, something that you'd be interested in engaging in a more active way, absolutely contact us, and we'll make sure we get you on the committees that you have interest in. Thank you, Amy. I think that's it. Thank you for helping us with that. We've got one more question. I don't know if we have Tommy online. We do. We have Tommy Gantz online. Tommy, welcome back. I'm going to read the question for you. It says, with this surplus in revenue, is there any discussion about the establishment of a rainy day fund? So that's the first question. I know that's a novel idea, but one that has been done before and proven to be useful. So I think the question is, with all this revenue, is there a rainy day fund? And if so, are they putting money back into it?
Well, we've had a rainy day fund. It's called the Budget Stabilization Account, and it was significantly funded. I think there was about $3 billion in it at the beginning of fiscal year 2019-2020. But instead, the legislature drained it, even though the state was not facing a budget shortfall. And then what they did was they created a shadow reserve account where if money is in the budget stabilization account, it requires a certain majority vote for them to access those funds and utilize them. But what they did was drain the fund, move the money to another fund or another account that would allow them to do what they would like to without the hurdle of votes. And then, we have advocated for them to refill that fund. Right now, at the end of 2019-2021, it was at just around $7 million, which would cover about 1/10 of a day of spending. So right now, we're rated at the bottom of state rankings around near Illinois in terms of where we're at with our rainy day fund. So we've been advocating to put some of the surplus back into it. And I will say that of the $8.6 billion that we have in surplus, about $2 billion is related to capital gains. So, and if that capital gains tax is overturned through the court proceedings, then our budget surplus would be at about $6 billion. So I'm really cautious when we talk about, we've got all this extra money, what are we going to do with it? I think we need to refill our rainy day fund as one of those things. As if the question is about whether or not transportation needs a rainy day fund, I'd have to defer to Mike on that. But this rainy day fund is around strictly the operating budget.
Thank you, Tommy. I see that we do not have any additional questions. Of course, if you come up with a question later on, absolutely please send it to us, and we'll make sure that the person, our director who's in charge of that area, that they can get back to you. I want to thank you for joining us on this 2022 legislative session preview. Appreciate your attendance, hearing from our team what's coming before us. I guess in summary, our message to the legislature is fairly simple. If we were to narrow it down, we'd ask them to remember a couple things. Number one, enough is enough. We've had multiple years of tax increases, a streak of tax increases year over year over year. We'd encourage us to have a session that breaks that streak, that we don't have a tax increase for the operating budget this year. Enough is enough. It's time to start thinking about moving in a different direction when it comes to revenue. Number two, make smart choices. We've got a lot of one-time funding coming from the federal government. We should not be using one-time funding to create new programs or to sustain existing programs beyond when it's only one-time funding. It's kind of like having a credit card. Just because you have a credit card doesn't mean you need to buy things, and you're at risk if you start just using your credit card without having the funding behind that. And so again, we would ask the legislature, hey, let's make smart choices this legislative session. And finally, and really to the key, with COVID here, with a lot of the stuff that we've been dealing with, it's really time to get focused on being a champion for the economy. We need to get our economy going, getting it back going strong. Last year, we've already mentioned several times, we're going to mention throughout the legislative session, talking to legislators about doubling the number of manufacturing jobs in the next 10 years, double the number of manufacturing job or companies owned by women in the next 10 years, double the number of manufacturing jobs owned by people of color in the next 10 years. This is what the legislature passed last year unanimously. Every legislator supported this. We want to make sure that this is just not a feel-good legislation, but that that there's a commitment there to make that happen. From AWB's perspective, we think it should be beyond the manufacturing sector. We think that there should be a focus that goes beyond that. But we also think manufacturing is a good start. And so we're encouraging legislators, and we'll be advocating and pushing legislators to focus on this, keep that commitment, because that's what's going to make a difference for the people in our state, helping to create more jobs, more opportunity for all of us. That's what AWB is about, and we want the legislature to follow in with that and help us make that happen. I'm Dave Mastin. I'm the vice president here. It's been an honor to be here. I've been here now for about 6 months as the vice president. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and to be able to talk about what's coming up this session. A lot more going on, and we'll definitely be in touch as session continues. Thank you and have a good day.